Welcome to Festival of Ideas Online. I'm Andrew Kelly, Director of the festival. This year we're running a project called Film 2021, a celebration of all things about cinema and Bristol, and we're working with filmmakers, writers and cinema goers on this. We're also back with our Festival of the Future City this October. Today we're talking about Billy Wilder and cities, which unite both of these areas of work. I'm joined by Shelley Frisch, the award-winning translator of Dietrich and Riefenstahl, and the 3-volume Kafka, published by Princeton University Press, among other books. And Noah Isenberg, George Christian Centennial Professor and Chair of the Department of Radio, Television, Film at the University of Texas at Austin. His many books include We'll Always Have Casablanca and Weimar Cinema. We're talking about their terrific new book, Billy Wilder on Assignment, Dispatches from Weimar Berlin and into more Vienna. Thank you, Shelley and Noah, for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate the kind introduction.
Can we start? I want to start with you, Noah. How did Billy Wilder end up in Vienna and Berlin?
So Billy Wilder was born in the provinces of what was then still the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the Galician province of Sucha, about 35 miles southwest of Krakow, Poland. And he and his family made their way first to Krakow, and when he was still a young boy, the exact age is never really clear, but he was younger than 10 years old when they made their way to Vienna and moved into the first district. This is the hub of culture and commerce. This is really the sort of the central district for those who know Vienna. And interestingly enough, it was not the second district, which is known as the Leopoldstadt, which is where a very, very high concentration of Central and East European Jews found their way to, when they found their way to Vienna after the collapse of the empire, after the Great War. They ended up in the second district. But Wilder and his family found their way to the first district. They were of I'd say relatively middle-class means, and had the ability to. They were upwardly mobile, and so Wilder did his secondary education in Vienna. He went to gymnasium in the Josefstadt in the 8th district of Vienna, and he was never a terribly distinguished student, and was often preoccupied with all things going around the urban life of that city. At a very, very exciting point in that city's life. He tells, among many, many anecdotes in different interviews, he tells the anecdote of being in school, and there was a hotel just across the Stadion, I think is what it was called, just across the way, which was a hotel by the hour, and he was completely transfixed by the various people who were going in and out of that hotel, and what kind of transactions were taking place therein. So that's how Wilder ended up in Vienna. He traveled mainly, ended up there with his family, and he traveled as quickly as he could. Actually, at the tender, he was just barely 20 when he followed the Paul Whiteman Orchestra to Berlin, and it was Berlin where he continued to hang his hat until the Hitler rise to power in January of '33.
Well, we'll come back to that. And we'll also come back to Paul Whiteman. Shelley, you talk in the book about how when this job was offered, you jumped at it. Tell us a little bit about the book, what makes up the book, and why you jumped at this opportunity.
Oh, there are so many reasons. Everything clicked somehow. Many moons ago, I was a professor of German, where I was also teaching film courses. It's back in that era, in the 1970s, when you had to hire projectionists to show your films. And I was teaching at Columbia University, which is in just very close to Midtown Manhattan. And most of the films were distributed by New Line Cinema, which was in Midtown. We had to race to get the film from Midtown, hire projectionists, teach my students how to write in the dark, because they were going to see it all at once. This was the pre-video era. And then they would have to write a term paper on the basis of a single viewing. And then we had to pack up the thing, get it back, hope that there were no tears in the reels or any of that, because you had this one golden opportunity. At any rate, I taught a good number of courses, mostly on literary adaptations of German novels into German film. And I also just gave an overview of the history of German film, basically a little bit along the lines of Siegfried Kracauer, from Caligari to Hitler. Started with Caligari and noted the political under and overtones of these films. So I've had a long-standing interest in film, professional and personal. I translated, as you mentioned before, a dual biography of Marlena Dietrich and Lainey Riefenstahl, who, when that book was presented to me, I thought, wait a minute, Marlena Dietrich and Lainey Riefenstahl, how could they possibly have anything in common? The potential acquiring editor gave me the book to read. It was still in galley form, and said, if you like it, we'll buy it. And I was in Germany at the time at the Frankfurt Book Fair. I sat down in a cafe and started reading it. And about less than a chapter in, I said, my God, why has nobody ever done this before? They started life as basically the same person and then went in these two fundamentally different directions, both in film and in fact, one of them with Billy Wilder. That was a wonderful project. I really enjoyed that. When Noah came to me with this project, I started looking through that. We were looking at 2 volumes, one pieces that were produced in Vienna, and the other one chronologically afterward in Berlin. And the idea was that Noah he already knew these pieces very well. I'd never seen them. To cull the very best of the best. And we had a lot of fun doing that and trying to figure out what would make an exciting volume, and made even more exciting by Noah's introductions to each section that really gave us wonderful context for understanding them in their time and how they foreshadowed his filmmaking activity. I hadn't known, as I said before, anything about this phase of his life, but you can see as you go through the pieces how much of what's there is already cinematic in flavor. You have some opening paragraphs that might as well be establishing shots for a film. You know, sort of people milling around a hotel lobby. Noah already mentioned lobbies for this hotel by the hour, but any kind of hotel, including the very grand ones. There was a tremendous interest at this time in the hotel lobby as a meeting place for all of society. And I'm now translating a book that's more philosophical in nature, that is also in part about hotel lobbies, go figure. And so that was a little bit of the fascination. So many things came together, and Noah and I had a tremendously fun time looking through these pieces and imagining them as a volume.
Well, that comes across, I have to say. A thoroughly enjoyable read, but also one that I learned an enormous amount from. Noah, it's a mixture of pieces, isn't it? It's longer essays, it's short reviews, it's news items. There's a bit of fiction in there as well. Yeah,
they're you know, for those of us who love Billy Wilder's movies, it's probably not such a surprise that when he was a young journalist, beginning in his late teens and into his 20s, that he took a little bit of, poetic license when it came to writing these pieces. And as Shelley and I have discussed over time, in some instances, we don't know whether this is a fictional persona that he takes on, or really whether these are, in fact, experiences that he witnessed firsthand. And in some cases even writes about, for instance, when there are 2 pieces devoted to the Prince of Wales. Only one of them actually deals with the real prince. The other, he tries to, the story goes that, he ends up at I think it's the Hotel Imperial in Vienna, and just finds some Englishmen who maybe will serve as an ersatz Prince of Wales. So yes, you're absolutely right, Andrew. The range of writing is quite extraordinary. From these capsule reviews to longer personal pieces. The opening piece is A Dancer for Hire, which was initially published as a 4-part serialized piece in the Berliner Zeitung am Mittag, and then was republished in one of the two tabloids to which the young Billy Wilder contributed in Vienna. It was in Die Bühne, the stage, that it appeared as well. And you can see the different kinds of publications he contributed. But what I think is there's so many things about the volume that I find endearing. But as somebody who writes freelance on occasion, but I don't need to live as a freelancer because I have the good fortune, the luxury of having an academic salary. But I'm very sympathetic to those who are cobbling together a living writing freelance. It's a wonderful window onto that world, and in particular, the world of Berlin. People who would congregate at the Romanisches Café on Kurfürstendamm, which was frequented by lots of artists and young artists, actors, writers, architects, and so forth. And many of them who were sitting there for hours on end, like young Billy himself, with a single cup of coffee and taking the newspapers, from the rack and reading them and schmoozing and kibitzing with their friends and trying to figure out, what's the next thing they can work on. Maybe can pitch a new story idea to one of the editors who's there. Maybe there's a filmmaker. You mentioned People on Sunday moments ago, Andrew. That script, if we can dignify it with such a term, it was really just a series of scattered ideas, was supposedly written on scraps of paper, possibly napkins, at the Romanisches Café by young Billy Wilder, together with these young budding Hollywood transplants in the figures of Robert Siodmak, Edgar Ulmer, who had already been in Hollywood at that point, Fred Zinnemann, and so forth, who would go on to really quite distinguished, or in the case of Ulmer, at least fascinating career, if it wasn't replete with the 6 Academy Awards that Billy Wilder would rack up. But so it's a great collection. I think, with all if I may say so, needless to say, I'm biased, but I think it's a great collection for people who are curious to learn about the city life of both of these cities. Berlin, so it was a Weimar era Berlin, about which quite a bit of writing has already been published in English translation, but I think here we get a different take on things, as well as interwar Vienna, which I think is a really, really fascinating place, and time, and young Billy Wilder, I think, is a great guide with all of that, the mordant wit, that playful kind of the mischievous spirit that we recognize from his later Hollywood movies. Much of that is there in embryonic form in these different pieces, and that's a lot of fun. I think it made fun for Shelley too, in terms of the translation process, which is really quite an art, if I may say. Not easy to capture the cadences, the tone, the flavor of Wilder's prose.
I was going to ask you about that, Shelley, because I always think translators are quite remarkable, really, because I always feel that they're not just translating a book, they're actually writing a whole new book, really. And how easy was this, in the way that, because I thought this when I read the book, that what Noah just said there about how you capture the kind of language, the tone, the wit, and so on in translation.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I would say that no translation project is easy. Language is written in the way that it's written, very specifically within the medium of the language of composition, and it resists translation with every fiber of its being. So every translation will come away from the original in some way. People talk about things being lost in translation. There's also quite a bit to be gained in translation, as Garcia Marquez said about the translation of 100 Years of Solitude. He said, this is a book he read when he read the English translation. He said, this is a book that should have been written in English. It's better in English. That kind of thing happens too. But what I aim to do in all of my translations, and this one in particular, is to step back from the word by word ideas and see, what is he trying to communicate? What is the spirit behind this? And that's why I'm so appreciative when Jonathan Coe, in the review of this book, talked about the brisk and punchy English. That's what I was going for. And I was so glad, and one must say relieved, that he saw it there. You try to step into a role. in some ways like being an actor, and speak with the voice of authority through that other persona. So I tried in some way to be Billy Wilder. I'm not Billy Wilder, but any gestures I made in that direction would be marks, in my mind anyway, of success in translating the project. I hope that readers in English would see the humor in the same way, the sly turns of phrase that are not really belly laughs, but more like little chuckles, and the very fast pacing of it, because it really comes at you in like an avalanche, or whatever the metaphor would be, meteorologically speaking. So to the extent that I was able to capture that, phew, because you play with words in your head. When I'm translating a book such as this one, I walk around doing ostensibly other things, but the words are already floating, always floating around in my head. And then all of a sudden I'll say, wait a minute, I know exactly how that needs to be said. And luckily I always have paper with me, and then I write it down and get it committed. Or alternatively, I hear a word that I love, and then I have to find a home for it in the translation, which is maybe a tool of the trade that shouldn't be revealed in a recorded segment, but there it is.
I can, no.
I was just going to say, if I could, that I think Shelley's translation manages to really channel the spirit of Wilder, and what she was saying moments ago about that, the pacing, that avalanche, as she put it, but the sort of the flits or bursts of speed, that I think is so true to Wilder, who was an inveterate pacer, who was always restless, who would in fact, drive certain collaborators of his, famously Raymond Chandler, to distraction, because he was, sort of flitting about the writing room, and also fixing himself an occasional martini in between, which was difficult for Chandler, who was trying to stay sober at the time. But I think the translation manages to again, in terms of tone, but also that pace, that very urban pace. It was the Weimar historian, the late Weimar historian Peter Gay, who referred to one of the publications to which Wilder contributed some of his later pieces, called Tempo, which seems like a perfect name for a journal. It was one of the so-called illustrated publications of Berlin, but it was known colloquially as Jüdische Hast, Jewish haste. And I think that you can see some of that in Wilder. He was really in a hurry to get not only from the provinces of Galicia to first to Krakow and then to Vienna, but then in a hurry to travel. We wanted to return maybe at some point to Paul Whiteman, but to travel with Paul Whiteman, the first chance that he got to tag along for that leg of his European tour to Berlin, and to experience all of the delights of Weimar era urban life in Berlin firsthand, and write about it, quite a few of those delights here in this collection. So
we'll stay in Berlin for the moment. We've got still a very young man, haven't we? Who education was not outstanding and so on, but could write in this wonderful way. You said, Noah, in the introduction that he was in Berlin at the right place at the right time. Tell us a little bit about that time.
Well, he came at a moment when I think Berlin was, compared to Vienna, a bit less stodgy, a bit more libertine in terms of its kind of the cultural and social mores of the city. And I think it was a very youthful place at that time. I think there was, in the wake of the Great War, I think that there was an opportunity for young creatives, as we might call them today, but artists, intellectuals, bohemians, to live relatively inexpensively, and to get by. He writes in the collection, he writes about this kind of the art of getting by, the art of being what the Germans would call a Lebenskünstler, sort of an art. It's a tough one to translate, huh? Shelley, Lebenskünstler. What is it? The art of getting by, I would call being a Lebenskünstler.
I think that's a good translation.
Yeah, and he was definitely a part of that sort of coterie of young and creative types who flocked from all over Europe, but specifically German-speaking Europe, in between the wars, and so he, I think, had a great opportunity. There were also Berlin, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not very good when it comes to statistics, but I believe, and I'm relying once more on that groundbreaking Weimar culture by Peter Gayback, appeared first in the late 60s. I think he notes there that Berlin had the highest number of newspapers, largest number of newspapers of any city in Europe. And so there were lots of opportunities for a young freelancer to, try his or her hand in the profession and hope, with any luck, land a few articles here and there. It was also a great moment, I think, in the history of motion pictures, in that not only did you have, of course, the big budget pictures that were coming from UFA Studio, the leading studio in Germany, but I think there was a kind of independent spirit, that same spirit that's reflected in such movies as The Late Silent, and one of the most beautiful silents, People on Sunday, Menschen am Sonntag, that Wilder scripted, and so I think there was this without making too much, because Berlin, especially Berlin as we remember it today, whether you're watching the big budget German television series Babylon Berlin, or you're reading whatever the work of Christopher Isherwood, or seeing the Fosse translation to the screen in Cabaret. There are a lot of cliches, obviously, that circulate around the world that has come to be known as Weimar Berlin. But I think that what Wilder is writing about is very true to that spirit, the spirit of the day. In terms of his preoccupations, in terms of his fascination with dancing the Black Bottom or Charleston, with cocktail bars and hotel lobbies, as Shelley already noted. Just a few years prior to this, I was lucky enough to be asked to write the introduction to the re-release of Vicky Baum's wonderful novel that then inspired the Hollywood film of the same name, Grand Hotel. It was originally called Menschen im Hotel. People of the hotel, or in the hotel, or Shelley, I'm gonna need to rely on you for a better translation. But anyway, became known as Grand, maybe because translation would not have been so great to do it.
Grand Hotel covers the ground, right?
Yeah, exactly. Better to do Grand Hotel. But in any case, Wilder was also, and this is sort of fellow Viennese in the case of Vicky Baum. Wilder was very much a part of that world. Baum as well. She became a part of the Ullstein. Ullstein was one of the major publishing concerns in Berlin, and like Wilder, she found her way to Berlin at that very moment. And so it was a very, I think, exciting period, needless to say, and one that had all sorts of terrific distractions for young people who were seeking distraction, and Wilder was certainly among those people.
And Shelley, you
city for people watching, which was what he did most of every day, if one is to believe his accounts of how he spent his time.
Now let's talk about a few of the pieces. I mean, there's so many we could talk about, and we simply don't have the time. And I certainly have my favourites, which I'll talk about a bit later. But Shelley, you've translated all this work covering a vast array of ground. What have you got a particularly favourite piece, and why does that? And tell us about that piece.
Sometimes people compare when you're asked which is your favourite translation. You say, well, I love all my children equally, to some degree, that's true here. I love the Dancer for Hire, which is sort of in some way the central piece here. I love The Art of Little Russes, which is about how lying should be, that is not lying down, but telling lies, should be part of the high school curriculum, because that's a skill that is essential to living a full adult life, according to Billy Wilder. I love the eternal optimist, that is the person who was hired to pretend to be one by sitting in a shop and smiling all the time and being paid a rather grand salary for no particular reason that he could divine. And the idea behind it was a very American idea, supposedly, according to Billy Wilder's take on America. This is the kind of thing that Americans do to, they smile all the time in order to feign optimism. And Billy Wilder, Noah and I have discussed this a bunch of times about how many of these pieces already have an eye toward his future life in America, as though he knew that he would eventually wind up in the US, I suppose, or at least he was angling in that direction.
Yeah, can I interject, Shelley, real quick? Because I
Sure,
think it
sure.
may be interesting for people to note that when he first took his job as a journalist, the impetus for taking the job, he thought that if he could become a reporter, and ideally maybe even a correspondent of sorts, that would be his ticket to America. So that's what really prompted him to go into journalism. He realized very quickly he had no English language skills whatsoever. So the editor at I think it was it was either Die Stunde or Die Bühne, one of the two tabloids in Vienna, said, okay, that's not going to happen. But he was very preoccupied with him, and that was handed down. Sorry, one last thing, and then Shelley, back to you. But it was his mother, Eugenia, who was a terrific fan of all things American and who had spent a formative period of her young life living with an uncle on Madison Avenue in New York City, and who purportedly attended one of the traveling shows, the Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill. And that's what prompted her to call her son, who was initially given the name Samuel or Shmuel at birth in memory of her father, she took to calling him Billy. And so there's this already, and I'll stop there, Shelley. Sorry for interjecting, but there's already this real drive, I think, and an attraction to America that's been handed down from his mother in his name, calling him Billy, and also I think what prompted him to write, initially to pursue the career that is reflected in these pages as a journalist. That's it.
He also has in these early pieces an interest in language per se. We find in several of the pieces when he talks to the Tiller girls, for example, they are sort of, I guess, showing off their alleged English skills, German skills, sorry, by messing up German spectacularly. I had to figure out how to translate those sentences. I left them in German because there was no way of showing a similar mashup in English. But this is an important era also. I think it can't be said often enough. When German filmmakers came to the US and German actors, this was exactly the threshold of a transition from the silent film era to the sound era. And so people who came at this time, all of a sudden, I mean, you see this most starkly for the actors who all of a sudden have these thick German accents. And, Conrad Veidt is a famous example of that, who then had to play Nazis, even though he was a passionate anti-fascist. Major Strasser in Casablanca and other roles of that sort, because all of a sudden there was yet this other hurdle to overcome, which was the language hurdle. Billy Wilder, fascinated by language, managed to I guess, turn a vice into a virtue, because so many of the lines are little games with words that I think really do come from the immigrant mentality rather than, I don't think a native speaker could pull them off in that way. Certain kinds of wordplay that show his in-betweenness in these two cultures. I find that really great. Andrew, to add one more piece that really appealed to me is the one on Erich von Stroheim, who basically was such a stickler for doing things a certain way that they said that you could only film one movie with him because he would bankrupt the studio that hired him. Of course, Erich von Stroheim was in exactly this linguistic situation. He spoke and somehow looked very Prussian, and so that had to be, I guess, worked into the new film medium that in Hollywood film as part of this Hollywood wave of German refugees. So I think that so many of these pieces show him already envisioning this new world for himself, a new world of filmmaking and a new world of language. And I found, as a translator, of course, I was doubly fascinated by that.
I was going to mention the von Stroheim piece because I thought he was a wonderful writer of people as well. He would really, really hone in on things. I love the von Stroheim piece, and also the one on Adolphe Menjou as well. I thought was a terrific piece of work. Noah, as a film historian, did he get these people right?
Look, whether he got them right or wrong, I can't say for certain. But he certainly, what he did do, what I can say with certainty is he animated. I mean, they are vivid figures, three-dimensional figures on the page. And again, as we were saying moments ago, I think about when it comes to Shelley's translation or just Wilder's language, there is wit and there is humanity. And there is the power of, acute power of observation that Shelley was mentioning moments ago, the kind of people watching. And he, so whether it's the Menjou profile or the von Stroheim profile, I think I can't say that this is the authoritative portrait of either of these two figures, but they're very colorful portraits, needless to say. And with the case, I'll just speak for a moment, if I may, about the von Stroheim profile, which I also really like a great deal. What I found fascinating is that he discusses, among other things, as Shelley pointed out, the the difficulties, the idiosyncrasies, the notoriety that Stroheim had in Hollywood for breaking the proverbial bank, whether it was in his megalomaniacal pursuit of the epic Greed, or whether it was other pictures he was involved in. I found that deeply fascinating. But I also, as somebody who's now working on a book on Some Like It Hot, I found it fascinating that he chose to focus in on Gloria Swanson and their collaboration on Queen Kelly, which then Paramount paid allegedly $1,000 for the rights so that they could, in the scene with William Holden and Gloria Swanson in Sunset Boulevard, they can show that the excerpt from Queen Kelly, from Gloria Swanson performing in a Stroheim film. And it makes that movie, Sunset Boulevard, so much richer, I think, especially when you look back at the work that young Billy was doing. As for the Tiller Girls piece too, I think there's a much deeper. In the case of the von Stroheim, obviously it's Sunset Boulevard, but in the Tiller Girls, you can see, I think, a very strong affinity or even an anticipation for the work that he would do together with his writing partner Izzy Diamond, I.A.L. Diamond, in Some Like It Hot, when he writes about the arrival of these Tiller Girls, the Manchester-based all-girl dance troupe, at the Westbahnhof station in Vienna. And it's wonderful. I mean, I don't want to overstate the significance of these little glimpses that we catch, but it is kind of gratifying for those of us who know his later career, to read these pieces that were written many decades before he went on to have this illustrious career in Hollywood, and to see these little germs of some of his later projects, whether they were in collaboration with Izzy Diamond or with Charles Brackett, his initial writing partner, or others for that matter.
And Shelley, some things really jump out for me. Things like when he talks about Cornelius Vanderbilt, the teeth, his teeth, and Paul Whiteman's moustache and things like that. It was a remarkable ability to draw out those things, I thought.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. He makes the smallest details characteristic of the person, pars pro toto, I guess, characteristic of the person at whole. And as Noah was saying, we don't necessarily know whether these characterizations are exactly true as portrayed, but they really do make the figures come to life. And you come away from this meeting with, you almost feel as though it was your meeting with Cornelius Vanderbilt. You know the man once you've left, not only his dental problems, but him as a whole on the basis of this one point. He's such a good observer. I've done a lot of work on the writings of Thomas Mann's children, who were in Berlin during the 1920s. and were very much, in fact, also wrote for Tempo that you were mentioning before, Noah. And it was a place for people who love to observe the small movements, small and large movements of people, and people who don't necessarily conform to conventional lifestyles, and Billy Wilder was so taken in by that. So there's the look toward America with Cornelius Vanderbilt and Paul Whiteman and others, and then there's the look in his own front yard, as it were, seeing how people operate. He was fascinated by the human condition. And tried to draw it out in all sorts of ways. And by the way, not only with people, in one of the most interesting pieces, all of them are the most interesting somehow, on the Ode to the Coffee House. It's the walls of the coffee house and their patina that take on almost a speaking role. They speak of the past and they come to life in that way. So it's not even restricted, oddly enough, to human beings. To have these speaking roles and to reveal a great deal of almost dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, the city itself, if you think about it, if you think, for instance, of People on Sunday, a film that's so much about looking and observing, and it has a certain voyeuristic strain to it, no doubt. But the city itself is almost the sixth protagonist in that film. And I think that, I love that. The coffeehouse piece is really great. That's he likens it to the what is it, the strings of a violin or something. I mean, I wish I had total recall, but just the way that he describes, yes, those walls that are almost anthropomorphized. The city itself breathes. I mean, this is, again, it's hard not to run into sort of semi-cliche territory, but there is this kind of sense of a pulsating, living organism, the way that Wilder describes, in particular Berlin, but even Vienna. I mean, that coffee house, that's Vienna he's describing there. You were talking moments ago, though, too, Shelley, about the sort of the wordplay, and you were attributing it to a certain extent to this in-betweenness and sort of the fate of the refugee, if you like. I think there's that, and I like that way of looking at it. I agree wholeheartedly, but I think that we could add one other piece to it, which is the Vienna in which he kind of came of age as a, at least into his late teens. He left Vienna as a 19-year-old on the eve of his 20th birthday. That was a world in which there were so many aphoristic writers who were constantly developing neologisms and lots of wordplay that, goes back to Wittgenstein, and if you want to take it to sort of a philosophical world, but also these writers like Karl Kraus and Peter Altenberg and these others, these sort of the coffee house poets or coffee house wits. And I think that Wilder comes out of that world as well. And I think that his sort of penchant for wordplay, I totally agree. I think a lot of it is that he has that ability as somebody who is keen on acquiring a whole new vernacular. And whether it's, by the way, the vernacular of motion pictures or the vernacular of of American slang, and sort of and foreign terminology, or it's that vernacular of an aphorist of somebody. These sort of compressed forms. I think that this little volume has pieces, as you were saying moments ago too, Andrew, real diversity. You have these longer form pieces, you have capsule reviews, but I think there is a tendency toward compression. The whether it's, and one of my favorite pieces too is on the Grok the clown, who was very famous. It turns out Lotte Eisner, who was one of the leading film critics during this period, she was also one of the early female film critics to attain such stature. She also, during her days as a journalist, she interviewed Grok the clown. I found that just kind of a fascinating coincidence. But these pieces can be relatively short, and yet he does capture some essence. Again, whether it's the mustache of Paul Whiteman, the teeth of Cornelius Vanderbilt, there's something that a hook, if you like, I guess that might be the language of journalism, that sort of draws us in, and that even in short form, in a piece of maybe 500 words, some cases even shorter, captures that person and animates that person for us, and that's, I think, is really quite remarkable.
One of the things that I mean, I liked the piece about the man who smiles. I thought that was a wonderful piece, and I loved the piece about Berlin Rendezvous, where people go to for dates and so on, because it did feed into the People on Sunday film. Now let's talk about his breakthrough into People on Sunday. He wrote. He also wrote quite a lot of other films, didn't he?
He did as a ghost writer, Andrew. He wrote a number. So he, not unlike the studio system across the pond, across the Atlantic, in Weimar Germany, the film industry had stables of writers, script doctors, if you prefer, many scripts written at that period, especially for UFA and other studios, would go through the hands of a number of different writers, often in an uncredited capacity. And it was really with Der Teufelsreporter, which is the hell of a reporter, sometimes translated as Devil's Reporter, that was done by Ernst Lemle, who was Carl Lemle of Universal Studios, the head of Universal. It was his nephew, and Wilder picked up a credit for that as screenwriter. And then People on Sunday, which was it's a lovely film. And it is very much a love letter to Berlin. It's also a film that kind of was a sort of a little engine that could story, in the sense that it was done on a minuscule budget by very, very inexperienced film professionals. To call them that at that time was maybe being a little overly generous, especially in the case of Wilder, who really didn't have much experience at all, and Fred Zinnemann, if you add to the list of collaborators there. But it's a film that caught the attention of the audience. And we were talking also earlier today about the sort of youthful spirit of Berlin. And this was a film that was written for that audience. One of the working titles was young people like us. And you can get a very strong sense of that just by the way in which Eugen Schriftan, who was the DP, the cinematographer on the film, where he takes that camera. And again, this is so much a part of the kind of spirit of the day. If you think, for instance, of the scene on the beach when you have these freeze frames, it's very much in the style of these portrait photographers, for instance, August Sander, and the sort of the Neue Sachlichkeit, as they call it, new objectivity, this focus on photography and advertising. And the film is really littered with these references, again, done on this sort of lemonade stand budget. $5,000, I think, was what, and Omer had brought some money back from his days working in the Universal Art Department, working for Uncle Carl Lemle, as he was called, and collaborating with Murnau and his American debut, Sunrise, at Fox Studio in 1927. Omer comes over with some money, and together with Siodmak and with Wilder, they manage to create a film that really took audiences by storm. And it was very much in contrast to the glossy, big budget confections that were coming off the lot in Babelsberg, at UFA Studio. And so the premiere in February of 1930, and Wilder writes there a couple of pieces that Shelley did a terrific job of translating in this collection, where Wilder, he kind of, he's not exactly attuned to certain ethical breaches here, or whether there might be a conflict of interest, because he becomes sort of from being the writer, the screenwriter on the production, he becomes the press agent. And so there are a couple of pieces where he's really doing PR work. And it's utterly unsurprising. I mean, I smile and laugh at it because I think it's just so true of Wilder. But he writes about the response to the film as well. He writes about putting together all five of these figures who were cast. I mentioned the sixth being the city itself, but all five were non-actors. They were, and in fact, they're playing the characters in the professions that they pursued off screen as well. Whether it was Brigitte Borchardt, who worked at the Electrola, the record store on Kurfürstendamm, or Erwin, the taxi driver, and so forth. And so what Wilder and company managed to do, I think, was really to reflect the lives of these young people in Berlin at that moment. And it was a colossal success. And so that's really, I think, that's the breakout. And he continued to write scripts, and you know, had there never, this is one of those thought experiments, but obviously had there never been a rise of fascism, had there never been a Hitler, I suspect Wilder would have continued to write for movies in Germany, despite that latent desire, and in some cases even quite explicit desire to cross the Atlantic. I think he would have continued on, so he leaves after the you know, stunning ascent of the Nazi Party in January of '33, leaves for Paris. He writes at least one credited, and there may have been more, but at least one credited feature film while he's still in Paris, and then crosses the Atlantic and on a 6-month visa that was provided through what was then, I think, known as the European Film Fund. These were short-term visas and affidavits that were provided for writers like Wilder who were stranded in Nazi-engulfed Europe. And there began his career.
One thing I want to ask you, Shelley, I mean, Noah's talked about what, you know, the sixth character being Berlin in this wonderful film. And we showed people on Sunday a year or so ago, actually more, and it still struck a real chord, I think, and had real resonance. What do you take from what he's written about Berlin, about the city itself, and what's good about cities, I guess?
Well, we've touched on some of those points already. It's a great place for people watching. It's a great place to see people who take unconventional paths. You know, these are some things we've already looked into. But it also, you know, Noah's way of laying out what would happen with people on Sunday brings to mind this phrase that I used earlier in our discussion, making a virtue out of a vice. You know, he didn't have the money. He couldn't have hired professional actors. He couldn't have done the big budget things that others might have done. So he sort of focused in on what he could do, and what he could do was what he did best, which was isolate these little ticks of everyday life. And urban life, I think, gives you the best lens into this. The Berlin of the 20s, I mean, so much has been written about it by Peter Gay, who's, by the way, when he lived in Germany, his last name was Fröhlich, which means gay. That is happy. And so when he came over, he just changed it to gay. But you know, there was something about the gay 20s, the roaring 20s, that was very Berlin specific. And what Noah was saying before about moving from Vienna to the stodgier of the two places to Berlin gave Wilder the atmosphere that he needed, I think, to build on these human quirks and see them in their, as it were, full glory. And it's very exciting to see him, to watch him watch them and then film them, write about them and then film them. It's also evidently when Billy Wilder went back to Berlin after the war, one of the most poignant encounters that he had there was seeing the place where the Romanisches Café, this gathering point, had been, and how it was destroyed. And he looked at that void, or that pile of rubble, I'm not sure exactly whether it had been cleared away at that point, of a world that had, you know, this cafe life that was so important to somebody like Billy Wilder. It was gone. It was gone. And one of the things I was looking at Jonathan Coe's wonderful Mr. Wilder and Me Again last night when I was thinking about our talk today, and you know, Billy Wilder, he has a beautiful section where Billy Wilder is reviewing all of the reels of film of the concentration camps, and somebody asked him, how can you do this? How can you look at all of this? It's just horrifying. How can you stay with it? And he said, I'm looking for my mother in all of this. So he was looking for a world when he came back that no longer was. And so it throws Berlin into a kind of tragic counter image of itself almost, the post-war, the immediate post-war Berlin. Very, very poignant on so many levels.
I mean, I think we've been fortunate this year to have 2 books on Billy Wilder, from Jonathan and from the 2 of you, and it's been both wonderful reads, really. I just want to ask a couple more questions. I mean, we could talk for hours and hours about Wilder in Hollywood and all the wonderful films. I think if you make a list of your favourite films, well, certainly I would, things like Ace in the Hole and Sunset Boulevard and so on. It was interesting that, he wrote about Stroheim, and then he didn't like Greed, the Stroheim film. And then many years later, he hired him for Sunset Boulevard. I've often wondered whether they discussed this together at some point. I mean, it would have made a very interesting moment, I think.
We'd hired him before too. There's a lesser known picture of Wilder's. I believe, if I'm counting correctly, this would be his second. I think it comes right after The Major and the Minor, which is directorial debut. That's the film with Ginger Rogers and Ray Milland in 42. Right after it comes Five Graves to Cairo, and he had him again. He had in this particular case, Shelley was mentioning how Erich von Stroheim had this air of a kind of Prussian, not only Prussian aristocracy, but also kind of Prussian military tradition. And he's cast in Five Graves to Cairo as this commandant, the way that he would then cast Otto Preminger in Stalag 17 as the commandant of the prisoner of war camp. So I think that Wilder, even though he had clearly left the old country for good, he continued to rely on not only on these various cast members, but on ideas that he was entertaining and articulating in the 1920s. For instance, so Love in the Afternoon is another favorite of Wilder fans. And that is on the Claude Anet. It's based on his La Jeune Fille Russe, his play. And there's the profile of Claude Anet here in the collection. And I think, again, I don't mean to overstate the significance of these profiles and pieces and reviews, but I do think that Wilder, even into the 40s and 50s and 60s, and he pursued a writer-director career all the way into the early 80s. He was very Americanized. He had become a naturalized citizen. He'd mastered the idiom. It didn't take him too long especially to capture the kind of the slang and all that. But he remained to the end. And in fact, it's Izzy Diamond and Jonathan Coe. I think there are a number of there was like set pieces in that magnificent novel, Conversations. And I think it's Izzy Diamond who says in Coe's novel that Wilder was very, very American, but also thoroughly European. And I think that you can see that in his choices of source material for the films, in his choice of casting. And what Shelley was saying moments ago, when that's very gripping, that the scene when they're going through. So he became involved in donning the U.S. Serviceman's uniform, returned to Europe, and together with the Czech filmmaker Hanuš Burger, they did a film called Todesmühlen, Death Mills, which was meant in the kind of the spirit of re-education and denazification of Germany. It was to be shown to German audiences. And Wilder, and his mordant and wit and gallows humor, he said that in an interview, he says the audiences would show up, but they would show up just they were supposed to get feedback with using these pencils and writing on cards. They would all steal the pencils. That's why they were there. They were there because of the scarcity. So the audience, it wasn't about learning about what had occurred. They all just wanted to abscond with the free pencils. But Wilder, from that period, I think, Shelley, you noted the sort of the void of the Romanisches Café, and you think of for instance, A Foreign Affair, and Marlena Dietrich, of course, her extraordinary performance in that film, but also the focus on the rubble of that city. And there too, I mean, Berlin plays I suggested maybe it was the sixth character in People on Sunday, but Berlin is very much a character in A Foreign Affair as well. And in fact, in People on Sunday may even be the star of that film. I need to revise my my opinion. But I think that Wilder to the end was straddling these worlds. It was the late critic Stanley Kaufman, who in a piece in the New Republic called The Call of the Wilder, referred to this bicultural lens through which Wilder sees things, that he's always refracting things through the sort of the lens of the emigre, of the former refugee, as well as the naturalized American citizen who's contributing to what is arguably the most American medium, Hollywood motion pictures.
And Shelley,
Can I just add to that? It brings me back, brings to mind the Dietrich and Riefenstahl dual biography that I translated, because you can see how these two women who started life in virtually the same way, one of them came to Hollywood and continued to grow as an actress, and I would argue as a human being, and Lainey Riefenstahl, who opportunistically stayed where she was and wound up filming propaganda. And these were Berlin was no longer a locus of creativity and excitement and finding new paths. It was all stymied and reduced to this one politicization in the worst way. And so if you look at the lives of those two women, now Billy Wilder, like Marlena Dietrich, got to leave the country, come to the US, and continue to grow as an artist. But as Noah has already said, and is evident in Billy Wilder's work, that and Stanley Kaufman said quite nicely, that this hybrid, these bringing these two cultures together with all of their warts and all, allowed for a really exciting admixture. Sorry, I just wanted to add that.
No, it's fine. We're coming to the end of our time, but I just want to ask one final question, which is, I mean, Wilder's gravestone about, I'm a writer, but nobody's perfect. But he was a brilliant writer, wasn't he, Shelley, to begin with, and I'll end with Noah.
Mm-hmm. I think so. It was very exciting to translate him because there are little twists and turns in his language. We don't have time to go into them at all at this point, but just little sly turns of phrase that you almost miss, but you don't miss, and they just ooze out of every word, and capturing them and holding them fast was a very exciting part of the translation work on this book. It was also great fun, I have to say.
And Noah, nobody's perfect, but a brilliant writer.
I think that line is in the AFI and perhaps in the BFI as well, is one of the most famous of all lines uttered on screen. Certainly the most famous final line of a picture, but it's certainly up there. I did that book on Casablanca. There are a lot of quotable lines in that film that are probably also in that pantheon. But to really peel away some of the layers of that and get to the heart of Wilder here, he was first and foremost a writer, and this collection gives readers a chance to see that development as a writer. He never, as he said repeatedly in interviews, he never would have necessarily taken on the role of the director, but he was getting fed up with the way that directors were butchering his words. You think now of Gloria Swansea, words, right? After the advent of the talkie, but the fate of the writer is not a pretty fate. In fact, William Holden's fate in that same film is not. You may find yourself face down in a swimming pool. And so Wilder decided to take on the role of a director, I think really first and foremost to preserve his work as a writer. And so he remained a writer and remained that to certainly to the very end. And even when in his collaboration, he grew as a writer, and the collaborations, they began in this country because his English skills were not great, but I think also as a means of kind of enriching his ideas. And you know, if we take the case of I.A.L. Diamond, of Is Diamond, and think maybe of the great snippets of dialogue that are included in Jonathan Coe's Mr. Wilder and Me, they not only were they like an old married couple, by which I mean they fought all the time, but they also they really filled out one another. They complemented one another, and I think that was important too for Wilder as a writer, as a filmmaker, as a human being, to have somebody who kind of completed him. Because we were talking moments ago, or Shelley mentioned, you know, sort of warts and pockmarks and all that. And Wilder certainly had his flaw. This is not an attempt at hagiography. We don't want to put him up on a pedestal, even though he had quite an extraordinary career. But he certainly had flaws, and I think that the writing partners helped to kind of ameliorate some of those shortcomings that he had as a writer.
Well, if you'd like to get a copy of Billy Wilder on assignment, it's available from our partners at Waterstones, all good bookshops, and direct from the publishers at Princeton University Press. We'll have more events online soon, and we're pleased to say we're returning to live events in September. We're also running Film 2021 events all year, and Festival of the Future City will be back in October. I'm off now to watch some more Billy Wilder films, I think, inspired by this wonderful book. Thank you, Noah and Shelley, for being with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Real
Thanks
pleasure.
so much for having us.